In a remote village, where the mists curled around the old cottages like a tight hug and the trees loomed like giants, there lived a young girl named Alara. Her small house rested at the very edge of the woods, surrounded by towering trees that twisted and contorted into grotesque shapes. They blocked out little patches of the sky, casting long, jagged shadows over her home, making the garden seem darker than it should be. With vibrant flowers and playful butterflies appearing during the day, Alara would often laugh and twirl about, chasing the sunbeams. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a heavy air would settle, swallowing the warmth of the day and leaving the village cloaked in a deep, eerie silence. Alara was not only known for her bright smile, she also had a gentle heart, always ready to help others. If a neighbor's child scraped their knee, she would rush to offer her band-aids and comforting words. If a friend faced sadness, she would find ways to bring joy back into their lives. Yet, within her, a growing sense of dread began to take root. It had all started on an ordinary evening when the gentle breeze swept through her open window, carrying whispers from the darkness that beckoned her to listen closely. One particularly dark night, everything changed. The moon hung low and full, bathed in a sinister glow that spilled over the landscape like a shadow come alive. As Alara lay in bed, the weight of her blankets pressed down heavily, and she began to drift into a fitful sleep beneath their warmth. Just as she felt herself slipping away, an unusual chill washed over her, penetrating the cocoon of her cozy blankets. It wrapped around her like a chilling embrace, like a figment of fear come to life. Shivers ran down her spine, and she suddenly awoke, startled by the overwhelming sensation. Alara turned to her window, drawn by the quick movement she thought she had seen. A shadow had flitted past, teasing her imagination. Her heart raced, pounding like a tiny drum in her chest, and her breath caught in her throat. What could that have been? The cozy, familiar surroundings of her room felt foreign and frightening. Then she felt them, cold, empty fingers gripping her shoulders. At first, the pressure was light, like an unwelcome visitor that had slipped inside to seek refuge from the night. She shivered under the touch, her skin erupting in goosebumps as she longed to shake off the sinister grip. She tried to move, desperately wishing to pull away from whatever was holding her down, but it was no use. The hands tightened as she struggled, pinning her down on the bed as if monster chains bound her to the mattress. Fear raced through her heart like a wild animal, clawing at the corners of her mind. This was not a dream. These were real fingers, as cold as the ice on a winter's night. Gathering every ounce of bravery that she could muster, Alara twisted her head to glance at the source of the icy touch. Shadows danced across her dimly lit room, weaving through the corners like malevolent spirits lurking just out of sight. In her peripheral vision, she caught a glimpse of a fleeting figure, faintly silhouetted against the encroaching darkness. Tremors gripped her limbs as she gasped, feeling a wave of terror sweep over her. The ghostly hands vanished as quickly as they had come, leaving behind only the bruises that encircled her shoulders like dark, ominous bands. Waking in a panic, her heart pounding like the drums of thunder, Alara rushed to her window, flinging it open wide in a desperate attempt to escape the suffocating dread that clung to her. The moonlight poured into her room, illuminating the quaint little village below. In that moment, Alara's heart sank. The reality of the night settled over her like an oppressive fog. The village had always felt safe and alive, with laughter ringing through the streets and neighbors waving cheerfully at one another. Yet now, the streets were eerily deserted, silent as a graveyard. A chilling silence enveloped the air, thick like fog, and hinted at something lurking, a malevolence that wasn't visible but felt deeply in her bones. Fear seeped into her very being. What had she woken up to? Had the village been harboring an ancient curse that no one dared to speak of? Was she not the only one gripped by the horrors of the night? Each step she took toward the window felt like a journey through a haunting dream, a nightmare from which she could not wake. As she peered outside, shadows seemed to slink away, retreating into the corners, whispering unholy secrets that sent an instinctive shudder through her core. Days turned into weeks, and each night felt like a long battle against the gnawing terror of the hollow hands returning. They would grasp her, tightening their grip as if they relished the taste of her fear, only to vanish before she could scream. Each morning, Alara would wake with dark, blossomed marks on her skin, the dark impressions left by those grotesque hands, slowly becoming an unsettling diary of nightmares etched onto her very flesh. The sensation of being hunted followed her like a dark cloud, pondering over her head, drowning her in waves of despair. She was determined to keep her pain hidden from everyone around her. No one could see how broken she felt inside. As the sun melted into the horizon each evening, her friends and family began to notice her change. They worried about her growing unease. "Alara, where has your laughter gone?" her friend Mia inquired one day, her bright blue eyes searching Alara's downcast gaze. They watched as the light sparkled in her eyes slowly faded, replacing it with shadows, darkness lurking within like a secret she couldn't share. Aunt Mora, her warm-hearted and kind aunt, grew particularly concerned. Sweet and motherly, she observed the dullness settling into Alara's smile. One evening, she sat beside her on the porch, where the sun was busy painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. "What's troubling you, dear?" she asked softly, gently tucking a strand of Alara's hair behind her ear. But Alara simply shook her head, the cloying fear stealing away any words or comfort she could muster. Her heart felt heavy, stained by dread, a burden too great for her young shoulders. As the days turned to nights, Alara felt increasingly isolated, like a lone leaf hanging from a tree in the grip of winter, unwanted and ignored. A whisper echoed through her mind, an unshakable fear that the spirits of the woods watched her every move, their eyes lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when she would slip into darkness. It was during one of these lonely evenings, as the crimson sun dipped behind the jagged skyline and shadows twisted longer, that she decided to seek the source of the unsettling whispers. Heart pounding with resolve and fear, she gathered her courage. "If I confront the darkness," she whispered softly, "perhaps I can understand it, and understanding it will lift the weight from my heart." That otherworldly night, with a deep breath that felt as if she were drawing strength from the moon above, Alara tiptoed out of bed and crept toward the woods. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves. Each step she took toward the forest felt heavy, like she was wading through a thick fog, making every sound seem amplified, every whisper of wind a haunting echo. The tall trees loomed above her like sentinels, their branches reaching outwards as if warning her of the ominous paths ahead. Alara stepped carefully onto a narrow winding path that led into the depths of the woods. Instead of the usual sounds of chirping crickets and rustling animals, the woods were eerily silent. There was a whisper of something in the air, a murmur that seemed to beckon her closer, teasing her curiosity and her fear. The deeper she walked, the more her senses sharpened. She could hear her own heartbeat, racing wildly in rhythm with the thoughts racing through her head. Would she find something hidden in the shadows? Would it speak to her? Or would she simply find more fear waiting for her, fangs bared? As she ventured deeper, a sense of wonder began to mix with her unease. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, creating patches of silver light dancing on the forest floor. She could see mushrooms glowing like soft lanterns, illuminating her way. It was a strange beauty, captivating yet eerie, as though she had stepped into another world. Maybe it's not so bad, Alara thought to herself, hoping that the moonlight would guide her away from fear. But then she heard it, the hollow whispers. They drifted through the trees like ghosts escaping from the dark corners of her mind, wrapping around her like an icy fog. "Alara," they called softly, their voices more like the rustling of autumn leaves than any real words. It brushed against her ears, sending shivers down her spine. The scare crept back into her, urging her to turn and run, but instead, she pressed on. Each step was like walking through quicksand, pulling her deeper into the unknown. The path twisted and turned as she followed the whispers that seemed to both entice and terrify her. "What do you want from me?" she whispered into the night, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. But the only response was the rustling of the trees, appearing to listen carefully, as if weighing her every word. The tension in the air was palpable, filling her with a mix of trepidation and fierce curiosity. It was as if the very woods were alive, syncing with her racing heart, echoing the emotions swirling within her. Then, just as the whispers began to converge, rising into a cacophony of sound, Alara found herself in a small clearing. The moon hung directly above, bathed in silver light, radiating energy that made the entire clearing shimmer. The faint glow illuminated strange markings etched into the earth, circular patterns swirling around a central stone that seemed to pulse as if it had a heartbeat of its own. In that moment, the whispers quieted, replaced by a soft energy that wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. "I've found you," Alara whispered, glancing around her, feeling both anxious and strangely at ease. The stone seemed to hum with rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and she approached it cautiously. As she reached out her hand, something miraculous yet terrifying happened. The stone began to glow even brighter, radiating warmth that absorbed the chilling dread she had carried within her. Alara, the whispers returned, this time a gentle caress rather than a terrifying scream. You are not alone. Her heart soared and crashed at the same time, both terror and comfort swirling within her. What does this mean? She asked softly, her voice a mere echo in the clearing, barely cutting through the soothing hum that persisted in the air around her. Face the shadows, they whispered back, enveloping her in an ethereal embrace. There is nothing to fear if you dare to look within. And with those words, the shadows that had lingered at the edges of her mind began to take form. Alara felt each one, fear, loneliness, sadness, gathering around her, waiting for her acknowledgement. Instead of fleeing or turning back toward the safety of her home, she stood firm, heart-pounding but brave. I see you, she said slowly, her voice nearly breaking under the weight of her emotions. I won't run. The air crackled with tension, like the still moment before a storm, and Alara could feel the shadows shifting, pushing closer in curious acknowledgement. In that moment, she understood, the darkness was not her enemy. It was a part of her. The light from the stone brightened the clearing, illuminating the shadows that had haunted her nights, hollow hands, fragmented fears, and unseen terrors. They began to dissolve, breaking apart into tiny fragments of dust, floating softly into the air until all that remained was a warm glow. Alara closed her eyes, breathing in the warm energy around her, filling her with a sense of release. Had she just confronted her fear? Had she met the darkness and understood its secrets? The weight that had felt so heavy on her heart began to fade. She felt lighter, freer, as if she had just stepped from the shadows back into the light. Perhaps from that night on, the whispers would still flutter in the night, but she wouldn't be alone anymore. Alara considered the challenges ahead with determination. She would be brave, and she could even find a new way to tell her story, one of courage and discovery instead of fear. With newfound hope in her heart, Alara turned back towards her cozy little home, knowing she had taken the first step to understand the darkness within, turning her nightmares into tales of bravery and strength. The village, now stirred from its slumber, awaited her return, oblivious to the growing light she now carried within. Alara stood at the tree line, peering into the murky depths of the woods that had stirred her imagination since childhood. The trees twisted like ancient giants, their branches reaching out, perhaps wanting to brush against her or maybe ensnare her. Countless stories whispered of creatures that roamed the shadows, grotesque beings that feasted on the lost and the lonely. She had always shunned these scary tales, thinking they were just that, tales to frighten children and keep them close to home. But deep within her heart, a sense of dread lingered. She had seen so many others vanish, swallowed whole by the forest, lost to silence, and, now, desperation drove her forward. She believed knowledge was her only salvation against the hollow hands that turned her life into a waking nightmare. With a deep breath, Alara felt the cold wind brushing against her skin, sending goosebumps skittering down her arms. It was time to uncover the truth. She took a bold step into the dark trees of the forest. As she crossed the line where the world she knew ended, a chill wrapped around her like a shroud. The twisted trees stretched their gnarled branches towards her like lurking hands, and the path was shadowy and treacherous. The air grew thick with an unsettling silence, broken only by the sound of Alara's heartbeat thundering in her ears. An ominous feeling wrapped around her, tying knots of fear in her stomach. But she pressed onward, driven by a courageous fire within. The soft crunch of dried leaves beneath her feet was the only thing keeping her company in this forsaken place. Each step felt heavy, as if the ground itself was trying to hold her back, unsure of her intentions. As Alara ventured deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around her, wrapping her in their skeletal embrace. Each step unveiled a new horror. The bark of the trees splintered and bent, twisted grotesquely, while the leaves fluttered as though alive with a ravenous thirst for something she could not comprehend. Shadows slithered across the ground, looming and retreating, creating an ever-flickering tapestry of movement that made her stomach churn. An inexplicable sense of longing filled her heart, mixed with a growing terror that threatened to collapse her resolve before she could uncover the truth. Just when she thought she could go no further, Alara stumbled upon a clearing. The sight stole her breath away. In the center stood an old, sacrilegious altar, decorated with bones and unholy symbols. The bones were yellowed, twisted, and forgotten, remnants of lives long lost to the darkness. Alara's heart sank upon seeing the putrid objects. Each twisted piece whispered tales of torment and despair. She felt a guttural ache in her throat as she realized this was perhaps the source of the unholy energy coursing through the woods. A place where some unspeakable force called forth the hollow hands, feasting on fear and suffering. Driven by an instinct deeper than her fear, Alara approached the altar. A dark energy radiated from it, a sinister pit that seemed to reach into her very soul. The air became colder, heavier, as tendrils of darkness began to coil around her ankles. The whispers were louder now, clawing at her mind, a cacophony of lost souls, tales woven together in a tapestry of pain. "Help us," they called, their voices echoing in her thoughts like a haunting melody that sent shivers coursing down her spine. End the torment. The weight of their sorrow pressed against her chest, threatening to suffocate her. Suddenly, she sensed movement behind her. Heart racing, Alara turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. Shadows danced at the edges of the clearing, and figures began to emerge, gliding gracefully like mist. As they materialized, dread settled heavily in her stomach. The figures were a chorus of malformed entities, grotesque versions of the fears she harbored deep within her. Hollow eyes peered from their twisted faces, fingers stretched outward, mirroring the chilling touch she felt in her nightmares. The creatures were bound to the altar, twisted by their despair, and she was tethered to their fate by the grip of those hollow hands. "Why have you come here?" Their voices hissed in a chilling unison that wrapped around her like a suffocating shroud. Alara's heart quickened as she took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to flee. "We sense your fear," they continued, their heads tilting as one, an eerie mockery of curiosity. "You wish to know the truth?" Alara's heart raced faster as panic swelled within her. "I want to be free of this," she cried, desperation spilling into her voice. "What are you?" The words tumbled out, each one heavy with dread. The hollow-eyed figures loomed closer, their presence suffocating, their forms wreathed in shadows that twisted and writhed. "We," they rasped, their voices merging into a nightmarish symphony, "are the harbingers of your pain, the extension of your mind, the echo of your despair." The abyss of their words swallowed her whole, and confusion layered atop her terror. Alara stumbled back, fighting against the rising tide of despair. The hands that had tormented her were a product of her own creation, her own fears brought to life. The realization hit her like a cold wave. This darkness thrived on her fear, feeding on the shadows lurking in the corners of her heart. "No," she shouted, shaking her head, willing the darkness away. "You're not real. You can't be." But the shadows only crept closer, their empty fingers stretching out toward her as if they had been waiting for this very moment. Waves of regret washed over her like a storm. She had stepped into this cursed place with determination, hoping to find strength, but instead, she had unearthed a well of insatiable horrors. The ground trembled beneath her, vibrating with an ancient energy. The earth split apart, revealing a maw of despair that yawned wide as the noise of moans and groans spiraled upward, like a fetid monster waking from deep slumber. This was no ordinary confrontation. This was an all-consuming nightmare, and the hollow hands were only the beginning. In that moment of dread, Alara remembered the stories she had heard as a child, tales told by the firelight. They warned of thick woods with twisting paths, and creatures that waited just beyond the edge of vision. But they always spoke of bravery too, of how those who faced their fears often found their way back home, stronger and wiser. As shadows surrounded her, a spark of defiance ignited within her. "Leave me be," she shouted, clenching her fists. "You have no power over me. I am not afraid of you." The entities paused, their hollow eyes widening in unison. The oppressive air lightened, if just a fraction, as Alara stood firm against the surging tide of darkness. Their whispers faltered just a bit, revealing a vulnerability she hadn't expected. Maybe this was the key. Understanding that these twisted forms were reflections of her greatest fears made flesh and bone. "Why do you torment me?" Alara asked, her voice trembling but resolute. "What do you want? I can't help you if I don't understand." In that instant, the atmosphere shifted, and the creatures stepped back, their forms flickering like flames in the wind. "Lost," they murmured, their voices losing some of their chilling sharpness. We were once whole, just as you are. We seek freedom. From the anguish, from the shadows that bind us. The weight of their words hung in the air, heavy with sorrow. Alara looked at the creatures and felt a strange mix of fear and compassion wash over her. But I'm afraid too. You feed on fear, just like the hollow hands that haunt me. We can help each other. A flicker of something, perhaps hope, appeared in their hollow eyes. Free us, and you shall be free, they whispered softly, a fragile agreement hanging between them like a delicate thread. I will try, Alara said, determination flaring in her heart. Drawing upon her courage, she took a step back towards the altar, the forgotten relic of despair that had summoned the hollow hands into her life. She stretched her hands towards the altar, feeling the weight of every heartbeat echoing in her palms as if the very land beneath her had a heartbeat of its own. What must I do? She asked, her heart racing with the thrill of the challenge laid before her. The creatures answered in a haunting song, their voices weaving together. Speak our names and set us free. It is fear that binds us, and love that releases us. Alara took a deep breath, letting the sound of their voices wash over her. Standing at the altar, she closed her eyes and focused on the pulsing darkness around her, transforming the fear in her heart into a warm glow that filled her spirit. The shadows whispered at the edges of her mind, but this time, she embraced them, allowing their pain to be a part of her, even if for a moment. I am not afraid, she shouted once more, her voice echoing defiantly through the clearing. You will not keep me trapped in this nightmare any longer. I name you, pain, fear, despair. With each name, a surge of light exploded from her chest, shimmering and flowing toward the creatures. They recoiled at first, shadows swathing around them, but then the glow began to intertwine with their darkness. Alara watched in awe as the gnarled forms transformed subtly, even if only for a fleeting heartbeat. Free us, please, came their chorus, desperation tinged with hope. I will not let fear control me, Alara said, and with that, she named them again, one by one, the words pouring forth as though they were the truth she had been searching for. Pain, fear, despair. I choose to free you. The moment she spoke those names into the dark forest, the air around her crackled with energy. A warm light enveloped the clearing, washing over the altar like a wave erasing all traces of darkness. The grotesque figures shrieked, but it was a sound of relief, as if the burden they carried was finally lifted. The shadowy tendrils that had held them captive began to dissipate. With each name she uttered, a piece of the dark weight lifted, unveiling the remnants of anger and sorrow that kept them bound. The darkness began to retreat, folding back into the forest as if it had never existed. And in that moment, Alara realized that in acknowledging their pain, she had also unearthed her own strength. She understood now. She was not alone in her battle against the hollow hands. The creatures, freed from sorrow, began to sway and flicker, transforming into a soft light that danced around her. Thank you, they whispered, the words echoing gently in the stillness of the clearing. You have set us free, and in freeing us, you have freed yourself. Alara felt warmth fill her heart, a wild joy swelling inside her. The shadows around her faded, replaced by a shimmering glow that filled the air with sweet relief. You must go now, Alara, a soft voice beckoned like a warm breeze. Return home. You have faced your fears, and the hollow hands have lost their power over you. With newfound courage, Alara took a step back from the altar, her path illuminated by the fading light of the creatures she had set free. The woods no longer felt threatening and ominous, they were alive, whispering secrets of newfound freedom. As she turned to leave, Alara glanced back at the clearing one last time, now a sanctuary rather than a pit of despair. The echoes of the creatures' gratitude resonated in her heart, filling her with hope. With each step back towards the tree line, she felt a sense of kinship with the darkness that once terrified her. The whispers of the woods were no longer malevolent, they were lessons learned. In the end, the hollow hands had only been shadows fueled by her fear, but no longer. That night, she stepped out of the forbidden woods, now forever changed. She knew she would carry the light within her, a flicker of courage that would guide her whenever darkness threatened to pull her under. Alara had confronted the shadows, faced her deepest fears, and in doing so, she had discovered the immeasurable power of belief, hope, and understanding, illuminating the path towards her own freedom once and for all. Desperation clawed at Alara, a feeling that took hold of her heart and squeezed tightly. She whirled around, turning on her heels, and raced back through the suffocating woods that seemed alive with whispers. The shadows chased her, swirling through the trees and reaching out like gnarled fingers trying to pull her back, whispering horrifying truths that echoed over and over in her mind. Each word pierced her thoughts, making her remember things she wished she could forget. Every step she took felt heavier, as though the ground itself conspired against her, trying to drag her down into the familiar darkness. The wind howled around her, a cruel voice tormenting the branches of towering trees, which looked like twisted hands clawing at her as she sped past. Alara pushed herself harder, longing to escape the sinister landscape that felt like a nightmare she could not shake off. She could hear strange noises behind her, the rustling leaves and the snapping of twigs beneath unseen weight, as though the forest was alive and hungry for her fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity sprinting through the dark underbrush, she burst free from the trees and stumbled onto the path leading back to her village. The sudden brightness of the path brought her a flicker of comfort, but the horrors she had just escaped still haunted her. She could feel the hollow hands lurking just beyond her sight, waiting for a moment of weakness. Alara raced toward home, heart pounding wildly in her chest, feeling the shadows nibbling at the edges of her sanity like a flock of gnawing mice stealing away her courage. As she approached the village, the comforting sight of familiar houses was turned upside down. What once offered solace now appeared as forsaken as the haunted woods. The houses loomed in the dimming light, their windows like hollow eyes watching her in judgment. She felt as if the very walls were closing in, ready to swallow her whole. Fear gripped her, tightening like a noose. Alara pressed on, refusing to let them take her. When she finally reached her own doorstep, the air was thick with tension. An inexplicable, strange calmness filled her heart, a false sense of hope, perhaps, but she held onto it tightly. She collapsed on the floor with a thud, trembling and gasping as if she had just escaped from the jaws of a dragon. The remnants of darkness still clung to her skin like a grimy cloak. It was in that shaky moment she believed she could fight back. Alara resolved to confront the truth haunting her, to unravel the threads of horror woven tightly into her existence. The hands would not claim her. Not yet. Days turned into nights, and the dust of her brave resolve settled but did not fade away. The impact of her encounter lingered like a ghost hovering in the corners of her mind. Inside the safety of her home, shadows grew bolder, creeping in like unwelcome guests clutching at the corners where the warm sunlight dared not venture. It was as if the very walls whispered secrets meant only for her ears. Alara began sleeping with her lights lit, the warm glow of candles and lanterns pushing back against the darkness knocking at her doorstep. But as each new night settled in, the hands returned, flickering shadows rising from the depths of her mind like monsters waking from slumber, pulling her under. Each grip of the shadows growing tighter, wrapping around her chest like vines, became more suffocating with each passing day. The air in her room thickened with despair. It was as if the very atmosphere was conspiring to trap her in her nightmarish thoughts. The markings on her skin deepened. What started as mere bruises now morphed into dark patterns, curling into grotesque motifs that mirrored the madness she felt within. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a reflection of her spiraling thoughts. A reminder of every fear and anguish she ever dared to bury deep inside herself. It was a relentless echo of her vulnerability. In a desperate attempt to find relief, to claw back to the surface, she sought help from her fellow villagers. The inhabitants exchanged hushed whispers and shared dark tales of an ancient being, an old woman who lived on the outskirts. This woman, cloaked in mystery and shadow, was rumored to have knowledge of the realms beyond, of things that laid hidden and deep within their minds. With her heart pounding heavily, Alara ventured into the village square, a place she had once enjoyed. But as she stepped into the heart of the village, she felt something shift. Gnarled faces surrounded her, their eyes filled with apprehension, and silence settled like a dense fog. Gathering her courage like a messy patchwork quilt, she approached the old woman. The woman sat hunched over, her gnarled fingers wrapped around a twisted staff. She seemed to shimmer in the fading light, her presence crackling with an air of age and wisdom. Alara took a deep breath, her voice quaking as she spoke. "I need help. I've been seeing things." The old woman lifted her head slowly, studying Alara with dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to peek right through her, seeing not just her outer form, but the very essence of her being. You tread where shadows linger, she said, her voice gravelly like the peeling bark of ancient trees, each word resonating in the hollow space between them. You cannot outrun your darkness, child. It knows you. Alara felt the weight of the woman's words settle upon her, wrapping around her like chains. It was a chilling realization, a dreadful awareness that her fight might be in vain. What can I do? She pleaded, desperation flooding her words. How do I stop them? Please, I can't take it anymore. The old woman's gaze softened, and she leaned closer as if sharing a secret meant only for Alara's ears. No one escapes that which they harbor in their hearts, she replied quietly, her voice like smoke drifting in the breeze. Your hollow hands are a part of you. To face them, you must descend deeper into that darkness. You must confront the fears that dwell in your heart. With those ominous words hanging heavy in the air, confusion paired with anxiety painted Alara's world in shades of darkness and despair. Every ounce of hope seemed to fade, leaving her spiraling into a chasm she had no choice but to confront. The woman's words wrapped around her mind, drawing her closer and closer to the very place she feared the most, the woods, the heart of her nightmares. That evening, under the pale glow of the moon, she succumbed to the pull of her fears like a moth drawn to flame. The night wrapped around her like a dark cloak as she wandered back into the churning depths of the forest, her heart pounding in synchronization with the rustling leaves. The echoes of her footsteps felt eerily calm, swallowed whole by the shadows whispering her name. Each hollow whisper called out for her return, tugging at her senses and promising comfort in the acceptance of her torment. As she roamed further into the thicket, the world shifted around her. The air thickened, turning oppressive and hot like a suffocating shroud as she approached the very altar where her tortuous revelations began. The figures awaited her there, twisted and grotesque, but somehow now, their forms shimmered like dark reflections in murky water, flickering and shifting as if they were caught between realities. You've returned, they hissed, their voices melding into a wicked melody that danced through the trees, twisting and turning with mocking laughter. Is it that you wish to join us? The shadows around her thickened, seeping into her thoughts, erasing the lines between fear and acceptance until she found herself teetering on the edge of surrender. Yes, she whispered, a small sound escaping her lips, and that single word unlocked the door to an unspeakable horror. Darkness surged forward like a shadowy tide, and the altar pulsed with energy, shadows thriving hungrily on her very essence. The hollow hands that had haunted her turned into a tidal wave of suffocating grip, digging deeper into her psyche, consuming her spirit piece by piece until the line between Alara and the creatures began to blur uncontrollably. As she surrendered to the encroaching darkness, she felt the weight of despair lifting, a strange freedom washing over her. But with that freedom came an unsettling realization she had become their vessel, a conduit for their twisted games and desires. She would no longer merely be their prey, she would become one of them, a fate darker than the night itself. And in that shadowy realm of despair, Alara realized she was not just fighting the darkness surrounding her, she was battling the darkness within her own heart, trapped in a never-ending dance with her fears. The line between sanity and madness twisted into an indistinguishable form, pulling her deeper into the abyss, where the echoes of her name sounded more like a funeral dirge than a call to freedom. In the depths of night, with sorrow wrapped around her, Alara made a choice. Would she continue to fight, to claw her way back into the light, or would she let the shadows consume her entirely, merging their existence with her own? The answer hovered just out of reach, the very breath of hope slipping into the chill of despair. Yet within that swirling darkness, a flicker of light dared to persist, a tiny spark waiting for its chance to ignite. Alara clung to that flicker, because even in the heart of madness, hope has a way of lighting the shadows that threaten to consume us entirely. Time, as a concept, slipped through Alara's fingers like grains of sand. She wandered deeper and deeper into the shadows of the forest, eventually slipping entirely from the grip of moments and memories. Days and nights merged together, blurring into something that felt almost like a dream. The sun rose and set, casting its warm golden rays on the village above, but those bright rays never reached Alara. Instead, they remained distant, illuminating a place that had forgotten her, just as she had forgotten what it felt like to be loved and safe. The village, once bustling with activity, became a mere backdrop to the chaos inside her heart. Alara felt as though she was lost in a never-ending nightmare. The hollow hands were no longer just figments of her imagination. They had stretched out from the depths of her fears and wrapped themselves around her. These spectral hands seemed to merge with her very being, causing her to twist into a strange reflection of the girl she had once been. It was like looking into a shattered mirror, where pieces of herself blended with the darkness of the woods. In the heart of the forest, Alara began to dissolve into the very essence of the terrifying place surrounding her. She was no longer simply a frightened girl. She transformed into a messenger of shadows, a being born from despair itself. Her presence drew in more souls, each one too curious or too afraid to turn away from the beckoning darkness. Once they stepped too close, they would meet the chilling embrace of the hollow hands, tendrils reaching out to grasp them, pulling them into the depths where she now dwelled. As the villagers gathered around their warm fires, they spoke in hushed tones of the disappearances that haunted their community. Eerie tales emerged, stories of spectral hands that lurked just beyond the tree line, claiming those who were lost to their own worst fears. The figure known as Alara became a whisper in the wind, a chilling specter that wandered the woods, her laughter echoing eerily through the chill night air. They would hear her plaintive call, "Help us," a haunting echo that danced like smoke on the breeze, twisting and curling into their minds. Days melted into months, and the horror that clasped hold of Alara fed hungrily upon the fear that smothered the village. The villagers gathered at a worn, crumbling altar in their town, sharing their tales and fears. They were haunted by visions of twisted figures, forever searching for answers that eluded them, all while showing the marks left by their own terror. With each soul that vanished, the whispers in the village grew stronger, sounding like a chorus of lost hopes crying into the night. The woods thickened with a darkness that felt alive, filling hearts with an icy grip of dread. No longer a mere soul shivering in the twilight, Alara's laughter transformed into something sinister, a sound so chilling it could turn the most joyful memory into a terrifying nightmare. She had become a grotesque embodiment of despair, her exterior a haunting collage of her former self and the malicious shadows that once frightened her. The hollowness within her grew, a void that craved others who could fill it with their own fears, pulling them into the endless abyss she now called home. As night fell, the forest came alive with echoes that danced through the trees. Alara's laughter twisted through the air, intermingling with chilling cries for help that reverberated, growing fainter and fainter until they became ghostly sighs. She glided through the trees, her essence melding with the shadows that embraced her like a welcoming hug. She felt powerful in a way that she never had before, as she enticed the lost souls to step closer to their doom. As whispers roamed throughout the village, dread settled over the villagers like a heavy blanket, weaving fear into the very fabric of their lives. The hollow hands were no longer just tales in the dark, they had become a reality, a physical manifestation of their deepest fears and regrets. Alara became part of the night, a reminder for the villagers that they were not alone in their fears, but soon their fears would become a part of the darkness as well. Alara reveled in the sensations that coursed through her every time a new soul was ensnared. It was a delight unlike any other, for with every grasp of fear, she felt stronger. Empowered by the dread she spread, she had entered into a new kind of existence, no longer the hunted but the hunter. No more fleeing or hiding in the shadows, for she was now the living embodiment of the fears that festered within the villagers' hearts, the very stories they exchanged with hushed voices on stormy nights. The woods flourished beneath the watchful eye of the moon, shadows swirling and twirling as if caught in a dark, eternal dance. The once vibrant village, filled with laughter and warmth, began to wither away, succumbing to despair. Hope evaporated like morning mist, leaving behind empty gazes that told of a joy long extinguished. It was as if the people of the village were marionettes, their strings pulled taut by the very fears they had tried to ignore. Alara accepted her fate with open arms, embracing the torment that had captured her. She became a shadowed reflection of her past self, a hollow reminder of the darkness that resided within everyone. The softly whispered words echoed through the trees, mingling with the rustling leaves, accompanied by the hollow hands that waited patiently, ready to clutch more souls and fuel an unending cycle of terror. There seemed to be no hope of escape, no glimmers of light breaking through the suffocating darkness that spread throughout the forest and the village alike. Every night, Alara relished the symphony of fear that rose up, the blend of her twisted laughter and the echo of sorrowful cries melding into a haunting chorus. It felt liberating to know she held power over the once cheerful village. She pranced through the trees, a dark shadow dancing among the green, and wherever her whispers drifted, hope seemed to vanish, leaving only dread behind. The villagers gathered in frightened groups, eyes skimming the treetops for her twisted figure. They lit candles in their homes, surrounding themselves with flickering lights that seemed to hold the darkness at bay, but it was all in vain. Her presence loomed closer with every passing moment, beckoning them into the shadows they dared not approach. Alara's laughter, once a mere echo in the distance, grew ever nearer, sending shivers down their spines as the wind carried her chilling words to their ears. "Join us," she would whisper to them through the rustling branches, her voice sweet yet laced with danger, promising solace but delivering only anguish. And though many felt the urge to turn away and flee, there were always a few, curiosity burning hotter than fear, who found themselves inching closer to the forest's edge. Among them, a few brave souls tried to gather their courage, sharing tales of Alara to inspire strength among themselves. They recounted days of sunshine and blue skies, moments filled with laughter, when Alara was still their friend. But deep down, they harbored a bone-chilling realization. The Alara they remembered was lost, swallowed whole by the shadows. All that remained was the echo of her name, now intertwined with the terror that surged through their hearts. With heavy hearts, some turned back, while others took hesitant steps forward. Alara watched from the shadows, a grin spreading across her haunting features as she thrived on their uncertainty. The anticipation filled the air with electricity, a pulse that entwined them all in a web woven from fear and despair. She could already feel their presence, each flicker of warmth growing dimmer, drawn to the very depths where she lingered. And as they gathered near the tree line, whispers of both hope and despair floated amongst them. "What if we can bring her back?" one would said, but it was quickly met with fearful shaking heads. "We must stay away. It's not safe. She's changed," another warned with trembling lips. Yet it was the voice of doubt, a persistent whisper, that echoed most loudly in their hearts, urging them to step back further from the shadows or take one brave step forward to confront what had once been a friend. Every little thought became a battle, swirling like leaves in the wind, and just as darkness clawed at the edges of their souls, Alara understood, the journey of fear has only just begun. Tendrils of despair reaching out from the depths of the woods would continue to grip new souls, trapping them within their eerie embrace, ensuring that the cycle of terror would feed on their greatest fears, feeding her eternal darkness. With tear-filled eyes and trembling hearts, the villagers battled their fears in an ever-spiraling dance, as Alara waited patiently. The hollow hands would stretch below the surface, always ready to embrace the next frightened soul, binding them to a fate written long ago. Wrapping the twist of bitter despair tightly around both Alara and those who would dare venture close, the woods would forever remain her haunting dominion, a place where fear thrived and hope lay forever dormant.